E-Compulsionen. 2016 is a film that presents itself as a psychological thriller about addiction, desire, and manipulation. But beneath the surface, it functions as a haunting study of power and self-erasure through a queer lens, one that exposes how women's search for identity and connection can be distorted by the structures that confine them. Sadie Glass's journey begins with the illusion of control. She is an author promoting her own story, a woman who has supposedly turned her trauma into art. Yet the reappearance of Alex, the man at the center of her violent past, reveals that her narrative has never truly belonged to her. His invitation to spend the weekend together is not simply a rekindling of old obsession, it is a test of whether Sadie has escaped the gravitational pull of male dominance disguised as love. When she agrees to go with him, her decision is not weakness but exhaustion, a quiet surrender to the cycle she thought she had transcended. For many women, particularly queer women, this moment rings painfully familiar. The pull toward what harms you, the temptation to revisit the spaces that once held you captive, not because you desire them, but because they are the only language of intimacy you've been taught. What unfolds at Alex's villa blurs the line between reality and nightmare, between seduction and coercion, and in doing so becomes a reflection of how patriarchal systems absorb and distort female agency until it becomes almost unrecognizable even to the women themselves. Francesca's introduction into this volatile triangle transforms E-Compulsion the Few from a tale of male dominance into something far more complex. Unlike Alex, Francesca represents fluidity, curiosity, and the possibility of connection outside the binaries that define Sadie's world. Their bond begins amid drugs and decadence, yet beneath the chaos lies something quieter, a kind of recognition. Francesca's gaze, unlike Alex's, does not claim ownership. It asks, it wonders. There is a gentleness in how she engages Sadie, one that contrasts sharply with Alex's hunger for control. For queer viewers, their fleeting intimacy carries both danger and liberation. It embodies the double bind of queer awakening within a hostile environment. To love another woman, or even to be curious about that love, often means stepping into spaces that others have already defined as transgressive. Sadie's connection with Francesca is less about physicality than about the longing to be understood beyond fear, beyond judgment. The tragedy is that this connection is immediately consumed by Alex's performative world, a world that turns intimacy into spectacle. What could have been healing becomes contaminated by the male gaze and by societal narratives that cast women's connection as either titillation or corruption. In this way, the film mirrors the real-world discomfort that still surrounds depictions of female desire. Audiences are taught to see it as a deviation rather than a revelation, as something dangerous instead of deeply human. When Sadie begins to lose her grip on what's real, the film shifts from external horror to internal reckoning. Her vision of a woman's throat being slit, a grotesque image that she cannot unsee, symbolizes the silencing of women's voices, their transformation into aesthetic objects of violence. She becomes the unreliable witness of her own trauma, a state familiar to many survivors of abuse who are told that their pain is all in their head. When Alex dismisses her fears, gaslighting her into submission, the narrative captures how easily women's intuition and perception are devalued. Francesca, too, becomes complicit in this distortion, her independence slipping as she falls deeper into Alex's orbit. The villa becomes a metaphor for the patriarchal imagination, beautiful on the surface, rotting underneath, filled with people performing pleasure, but bound by control. Sadie's attempts to escape, to reclaim her agency, are constantly thwarted, not only by Alex, but by the social conditioning that has taught her to conflate love with suffering. This dynamic resonates strongly with queer women who have had to navigate relationships or environments that demand the suppression of self. It speaks to how power structures, both personal and societal, can infiltrate even the most intimate spaces, teaching women to doubt their own perceptions and to question the legitimacy of their desires. The turning point comes when Sadie decides to act, not out of rebellion, but out of survival. Her confrontation with Alex at the final party plays out like a distorted ritual, with Thierry, the man who represents the illusion of normalcy, bound and surrounded by revelers lost in collective delusion. Francesca's role as the executioner reflects how women, too, can be drawn into perpetuating violence when they are denied autonomy. When Sadie takes the knife, the act of cutting her own arm becomes symbolic defiance. She will not be a vessel for someone else's cruelty. Her decision to kill Alex is not revenge but release, the reclaiming of a narrative that has been written through her body. For queer audiences, this moment can be read as an allegory for rejecting the scripts imposed upon us. The heteronormative, the submissive, the expected, and writing new ones with our own blood if we must. It is messy, imperfect liberation, but liberation nonetheless. Yet the film refuses easy closure. Francesca's murder of Thierry complicates Sadie's victory, showing that violence cannot simply be undone once it has rooted itself in intimacy. When Francesca vanishes, she takes with her both the promise of queer connection and the reminder that trauma, once shared, binds people in ways that transcend morality or logic. The final scenes in New York expose the illusion of healing that society often demands from women who survive violence. Sadie sits in a polished restaurant, reading from her new book, performing the role of a woman who has turned pain into art, chaos into narrative. But this performance, too, is haunted. Francesca's sudden reappearance reminds her, and the audience, that healing is not linear, that the past does not vanish just because it has been published. The revelation that Sadie killed Alex before the events of the film reframes everything as both confession and repression. Perhaps the entire narrative was her mind's way of retelling the trauma until she could own it. When she sees Francesca seated beside Alex in the car, alive, it blurs the line between memory and imagination, victim and perpetrator, love and compulsion. For queer women, this ambiguity holds profound weight. It reflects how identity and desire can be fractured by external forces, how the process of coming to terms with one's truth often feels like walking through a hall of mirrors, where every reflection shows a different version of yourself. What makes E-Compulsion fascinating through a queer feminist lens is how it refuses to grant any of its characters moral clarity. Sadie, Francesca, and even Alex are trapped within a web of social and psychological conditioning that feeds on control, fear, and performance. The film becomes less about violence and more about visibility. What happens when women's desires and vulnerabilities are exposed in a world that insists on consuming them? Sadie's story mirrors the experiences of countless queer women who have been punished for wanting more than what they were allowed: emotional honesty, physical autonomy, the right to define their own stories. The discomfort the film evokes in viewers, its hazy reality, its moral unease, mirrors the discomfort society still feels toward women who step outside traditional narratives of purity or victimhood. Sadie and Francesca's brief connection, however corrupted, offers a glimpse of something sacred, two women seeing each other not as objects of desire or competition, but as mirrors of pain and potential. In the end, E-Compulsion is not a film about sex or crime, it is about the cost of repression and the danger of storytelling itself. Sadie's writing becomes both weapon and wound, a way to make sense of chaos that simultaneously traps her within it. Her journey from victim to storyteller is not empowerment in the conventional sense. It is survival. She learns that owning her truth means accepting the contradictions within it, the coexistence of love and fear, creation and destruction, intimacy and power. For women and queer audiences, her story resonates because it refuses to simplify these contradictions. It reminds us that freedom is not the absence of darkness, but the courage to face it without letting it define us. Sadie's final gaze, haunted, unresolved, yet unflinching, becomes a testament to every woman who has had to rebuild herself after being consumed by someone else's narrative. She is not redeemed, but she is real. And for those of us who have ever felt our voices silenced or our desires twisted by expectation, that reality, raw, imperfect, visible, is the most radical act of all.